"Did you enjoy the lake house I bought you, Mom?" Daniel asked with an easy smile, and for a moment Margaret Hayes forgot how to breathe. The question floated across the Thanksgiving table like steam rising from the turkey, warm and ordinary on the surface, yet sharp enough to slice through everything she thought she understood about her life. The dining room of her modest Ohio ranch house glowed with soft yellow light, the kind that made the worn oak table look almost elegant. She had polished it that morning, just as she had every Thanksgiving since her husband passed away 3 years earlier. At 72, Margaret still believed in setting the table properly, even if it was just for 3 people. She used her late husband's favorite white china, placed the cranberry sauce in the crystal bowl saved for holidays, and folded the cloth napkins with careful hands that trembled only slightly from age. Outside, the November wind brushed against the siding, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. Inside, everything smelled of rosemary, butter, and the pumpkin pie cooling on the kitchen counter. Daniel looked successful in a way that still startled her sometimes. His tailored navy sweater, the sleek watch at his wrist, the confidence in his posture. None of it matched the boy who once rode his bike in this very driveway. At 38, he owned a thriving tech consulting firm in Chicago, employed more than 200 people, and spoke casually about investments and expansion plans over dinner. Beside him sat Victoria, composed and polished in a cream-colored dress that looked like it belonged in a catalog. She smiled politely, but her eyes were alert, calculating in a way Margaret had never quite known how to interpret. Margaret blinked at her son. "What lake house?" she asked quietly, her voice steady though her chest felt tight. Daniel laughed at first, assuming she was teasing. "The one on Lake Morrison. I transferred it to you 2 years ago for your birthday. You said you always wanted to live near the water." The room seemed to tilt, just slightly. Margaret had lived in the same 1,400-square-foot house for 41 years. The roof still leaked near the chimney after heavy rain. She rationed her heating in winter, keeping the thermostat at 65 degrees to save on gas. She clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and drove. A 12-year-old sedan with over 140,000 miles on it. If someone had gifted her a lake house, she would have known. She would have remembered. Victoria's fork paused midair. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but Margaret noticed. Daniel's smile began to fade as he studied his mother's face more closely. "Mom, don't tell me you forgot. I had my assistant handle the deed. And the monthly transfers, $1,500 for upkeep and expenses. $1,500 a month." Margaret felt her fingers curl gently around her napkin. For 2 years, that would have been $36,000. Enough to cover her prescriptions without splitting pills in half. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to stop worrying every time the electric bill arrived. She met her son's eyes. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I have never received a lake house. And I have never received any monthly transfers." The silence that followed was not loud. It was the quiet kind that settles heavily, pressing into the walls, into the floorboards, into the spaces between people. Daniel's brow furrowed, confusion replacing certainty. Victoria set her fork down with deliberate calm and reached for her water glass. But her hand was not as steady as before. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone. She simply sat there in her small dining room, surrounded by the life she had built with careful sacrifice, and realized that something fundamental had been happening without her knowledge. Something large, something hidden. And for the first time that evening, she felt not just surprise, but the slow, unmistakable chill of a truth waiting to surface. Daniel did not argue with her. He did not accuse her of forgetting. Instead, he reached for his phone with the focused expression he used in business meetings, scrolling through emails and banking confirmations as though the answer could be solved by data alone. Margaret watched him from across the table, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The turkey had grown cold. The candles she had lit an hour earlier burned lower, wax pooling quietly at their bases. It was strange how ordinary the room still looked. The framed photograph of her late husband sat on the sideboard. The curtains fluttered slightly with the draft near the window. Everything appeared exactly as it had that morning, yet the air felt thinner now, as if something invisible had shifted. Daniel turned the screen toward her. "Here," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "The deed transfer confirmation. 2 years ago, and monthly payments scheduled on the 1st of every month." Margaret leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. The document showed her name clearly typed in formal letters. Margaret and Hayes. The address listed, however, was unfamiliar. A lakeside property in northern Michigan. 3 bedrooms. 2 bathrooms. Private dock. She felt a faint ringing in her ears. She had never been to that address. She had never signed anything for it. She thought about her birthday 2 years ago. She had spent it alone, baking herself a small vanilla cake and taking a walk around the block because the weather had been unseasonably warm for early October. Daniel had called that evening, apologizing for being busy. He had not mentioned any gift beyond flowers that arrived the next day. "Daniel," she said gently, "I have never seen these papers before." Victoria's chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor as she shifted. "Maybe there was a mailing issue," she offered, her tone light but carefully measured. "Sometimes legal documents get lost." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law for a long moment. Victoria's smile remained in place, but it no longer reached her eyes. Daniel continued scrolling. "The payments were set up through my primary account. $1,500 a month. Automatic transfer." He looked up. "Mom, you are telling me you never received that money?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I balance my checkbook every Sunday afternoon," she replied. "There has never been an extra $1,500. She did not mention the evenings she had sat at this same table calculating whether she could postpone refilling a prescription until her next Social Security deposit. She did not mention the leak in the roof that she had patched temporarily with sealant from the hardware store because hiring a contractor felt too expensive. She simply stated the fact. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That is $36,000, he murmured, more to himself than to her. The number hung in the air like a weight. Victoria reached for her phone then, glancing down at the screen. "I just remembered I need to confirm something for tomorrow," she said, rising from the table. Margaret watched her walk toward the kitchen. The hallway light cast a narrow shadow across the floor as Victoria disappeared. From view, Daniel remained seated, staring at the banking app on his phone as though it had betrayed him personally. Margaret felt a steady calm settling over her. Not relief, not anger, something colder and clearer. For 2 years she had believed her son was simply busy, distant, wrapped up in a world that no longer included her daily struggles. Now she understood that the distance might have been built on something else entirely, something deliberate. And for the first time that evening, she realized that the truth was not going to reveal itself politely. It would have to be uncovered. Daniel did not wait long before standing from the table. He walked toward the kitchen where Victoria had disappeared, his footsteps measured but firm against the hardwood floor. Margaret remained seated, listening to the low murmur of their voices beyond the doorway. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough to understand that something inside her son was beginning to fracture. The house felt smaller now, as though the walls were leaning in to witness what would happen next. She rose slowly and carried the untouched plates into the kitchen, moving with the steady rhythm of habit. For decades, she had believed that problems could be softened by routine, that clearing a table and washing dishes could restore order to any evening. Tonight, the plates felt heavier in her hands. Daniel stood near the counter, phone pressed against his ear. His tone had shifted into the controlled calm he used when negotiating contracts. He was asking his assistant to resend the full documentation for the property transfer and the account routing numbers associated with the monthly payments. Victoria stood by the sink, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her expression was composed, but her gaze flickered whenever Daniel mentioned dates or transaction confirmations. Margaret placed the plates in the sink and turned on the faucet. The sound of running water filled the room, covering the tension like a thin curtain. She focused on the simple motion of washing, the warmth of the water against her hands, the familiar scent of dish soap. She had always believed in dignity, even in moments of discomfort. She would not accuse without proof. She would not allow herself to be dramatic. Daniel ended the call and exhaled slowly. "They are sending everything to my email right now," he said. His eyes moved from his wife to his mother. "There has to be an explanation." Margaret nodded. "Of course," she replied softly. She did not look at Victoria, but she felt the younger woman's presence sharply, like a draft slipping through a closed window. Within minutes, Daniel's phone chimed repeatedly. He opened the attachments, scrolling through digital copies of deeds, transfer receipts, and bank statements. His brow tightened as he examined the routing number listed under the monthly transfers. "This is not Mom's bank," he said quietly. "It is a different institution." Victoria stepped forward quickly. "Maybe your assistant entered it incorrectly," she suggested. "Mistakes happen." Daniel shook his head. "The routing number belongs to a private holding account." He paused, reading further. "It is registered under a limited liability company." The words seemed to settle heavily in the room. Margaret turned off the faucet and dried her hands carefully. She had never cared much for business structures or corporate names. Yet she understood what a holding company implied. It implied intention. It implied planning. Daniel continued reading, his voice lower now. "The authorized contact for the account is Victoria Hayes." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion. It was clarity arriving slowly, piece by piece. Margaret felt her heartbeat steady rather than race. For 2 years, she had assumed that the distance between her and her son was the natural consequence of his success and busy life. Now she saw that the distance had been managed, guided. She looked at Victoria then, not with anger, but with quiet recognition. The truth had begun to surface, and it no longer needed to be chased. It was standing plainly in the center of her kitchen. Victoria did not deny it immediately. She did not raise her voice or break down. Instead, she stood very still, as though stillness itself might slow the direction of the evening. Daniel lowered his phone gradually, the screen dimming between his fingers. "You are the authorized contact," he repeated, not loudly, but with a precision that left no room for interpretation. Margaret watched the exchange without stepping in. She had learned long ago that silence often reveals more than confrontation. For years she had interpreted Victoria's efficiency as helpfulness. Victoria had offered to organize paperwork after Margaret's husband passed away. She had volunteered to streamline communication with Daniel's office to make sure financial matters were handled smoothly so that Margaret would not have to worry. At the time, it had seemed considerate. Margaret had been grieving then, overwhelmed by insurance forms and retirement accounts. Victoria had appeared capable, steady, eager to assist. Now those memories rearranged themselves in her mind, like furniture being moved into clearer alignment. She remembered the afternoon Victoria had insisted that direct deposits would be easier if she helped coordinate the banking details. She remembered how Daniel had said, "Victoria is better with this kind of thing." She had not argued. She had trusted. Daniel finally spoke again. "Why is your name connected to this account?" His tone remained controlled, but confusion had hardened into something sharper. Victoria drew in a slow breath. "I was trying to manage the investment efficiently," she said. "You are busy. I thought it made sense to consolidate the transfers into a holding structure first." It was temporary. Margaret noticed that Victoria did not look at her while explaining. She kept her gaze fixed on Daniel, as though Margaret were no longer part of the equation. "Temporary for 2 years?" Daniel asked quietly. Victoria's composure flickered. "I planned to tell you once everything stabilized." Margaret felt a faint ache behind her ribs, not from anger, but from recognition. This was not an impulsive mistake. It was a system, a quiet redirection of funds under the cover of efficiency. She stepped toward the table and rested her fingertips lightly on the back of a chair. "Daniel," she said softly, "I never needed a lake house. I only needed honesty." The simplicity of her words seemed to land heavier than accusation. Daniel looked at his mother then, truly looked at her, perhaps noticing for the first time the careful way she lived. The modest curtains, the aging appliances, the small details that spoke of restraint rather than abundance. He ran a hand slowly across his forehead. "The deed never reached you," he murmured, almost to himself. "The money never reached you." Margaret shook her head once. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking the seconds of an evening that had begun with gratitude and turned into revelation. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows again, and somewhere in the distance a car door slammed as neighbors gathered for their own celebrations. Inside the house, the truth no longer felt hidden. It felt exposed, fragile but undeniable. Margaret understood then that trust is not broken in dramatic moments. It erodes quietly, in forms signed without scrutiny, in accounts managed without oversight, in kindness offered too eagerly. And as she looked at her son standing between confusion and awakening, she realized that what mattered most was not the money, nor the property by the lake, but whether the foundation between them could survive what had just come to light. Daniel did not argue further that night. He gathered the printed confirmations from his email, forwarded them to his personal attorney, and said very little as he helped clear the table. Victoria retreated into a silence that felt deliberate, answering only when spoken to, her earlier composure replaced by careful restraint. Margaret finished washing the last dish and dried her hands slowly, aware that something irreversible had begun. The evening ended without raised voices. Daniel insisted on staying at a nearby hotel instead of driving back to Chicago in the dark. Victoria agreed without protest. Margaret stood at the front door as they stepped into the cold November air, her cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Daniel paused before leaving. "Mom," he said quietly, "I am going to look into everything first thing in the morning." She nodded once. "That is all I ask." When the door closed, the house felt both heavier and clearer. Margaret turned off the porch light and walked back into the living room. The Thanksgiving decorations remained untouched. The small ceramic pumpkins on the mantel, the embroidered table runner she had used for years. She sank into her armchair and listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock. She did not cry. Instead, she replayed the past 2 years with a new lens. She remembered how Victoria had encouraged Daniel to move most of his financial operations under a centralized management structure. She remembered how often Victoria had spoken about efficiency, about consolidating assets, about protecting investments. Margaret had never questioned those conversations. She had assumed that success required complexity. The next morning arrived gray and quiet. Margaret woke before sunrise, brewed her coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. She listed every month she could remember worrying about bills. Every time she had postponed a home repair. Every prescription she had stretched longer than recommended. Not as an accusation, but as a record. Around 9 o'clock, her phone rang. Daniel's voice sounded different, stripped of confidence. "The holding company was created 18 months ago," he said. "Victoria is listed as managing member. The account received the transfers exactly as scheduled." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "And the property?" she asked. "The deed was never fully registered in your name," Daniel admitted. "It remained under the company." There was a long pause. Margaret could hear traffic in the background, perhaps from the hotel parking lot. "I trusted her," Daniel said finally, not defensively, but quietly. Margaret traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. "Trust is not foolish," she replied. "It is necessary, but it must be protected." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I am meeting with my attorney in an hour. I am freezing the account and initiating a full audit." Margaret felt no triumph at his words, only a steady resolve. This was no longer about proving wrongdoing. It was about restoring order. She glanced around her small kitchen, at the worn cabinets and the faded wallpaper she had once chosen with her husband decades ago. She had built her life carefully, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. She would not allow it to be quietly redirected again. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, and Margaret understood that while storms arrive without warning, what follows is clarity. And clarity, once seen, cannot be ignored. Daniel called again just before noon, his voice steadier but stripped of any remaining illusion. The audit had begun, and the numbers were no longer abstract entries on a screen. They formed a pattern. The holding company had not only received the monthly transfers meant for Margaret, it had also been used to secure a line of credit against the lakeside property. Victoria had signed as managing member. The funds had been redirected into a series of investments tied to her personal portfolio. None of it had Daniel's direct authorization beyond the original instruction to transfer money for his mother's benefit. Margaret listened without interrupting, seated at her kitchen table with the afternoon light falling across the worn linoleum floor. She felt neither outrage nor satisfaction, only a quiet understanding that intention reveals itself through repetition. "Was the property ever meant to be fully transferred?" she asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. "The initial paperwork listed you as beneficiary," he admitted. "But the final registration stalled. Victoria told me there were delays with the county recorder's office." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Delays. Efficiency. Consolidation. Words that had once sounded responsible now felt like carefully chosen curtains drawn over something else. "The attorney believes there was misrepresentation," Daniel continued. He says we can reverse the transfers and formally complete the deed in your name. Margaret rose and walked toward the living room window. The sky had cleared, revealing a pale winter sun over the quiet street. A neighbor was raking leaves into neat piles. Life outside continued as usual, indifferent to private revelations. Do what is necessary, she said gently. But do it correctly. Daniel's silence on the other end carried weight. I should have checked sooner, he murmured. Margaret considered that. For years she had told herself that Daniel's distance was the natural result of ambition and success. She had excused missed calls, postponed visits, hurried conversations. Now she saw how easily trust can be outsourced. It can be delegated along with paperwork and signatures until no one remembers who it was meant to protect. Daniel, she said softly, success does not replace vigilance. It requires it. There was a long pause before he responded. I understand. Later that afternoon, Daniel met with his attorney in person. Margaret received updates in measured intervals. The holding account was frozen. The line of credit flagged. Formal demand letters prepared. Victoria had been notified that all financial authority was suspended pending review. Margaret did not ask how the conversation between them unfolded. She did not need details of tone or reaction. What mattered was movement toward correction. That evening, Margaret sat in her armchair once more, the house quiet around her. She thought about the lake house she had never seen. 3 bedrooms. A private dock. She imagined water stretching out under open sky, calm and reflective. It was not the property itself that stirred her thoughts, but the idea that her name had been used without her knowledge. She had lived her life deliberately, carefully signing every document, reading every clause. To have her identity attached to something she had never consented to felt like a subtle erasure. And yet, as the sun lowered beyond the rooftops, she felt something else as well. A return of balance. The truth had been uncovered without shouting, without spectacle. It had surfaced through patience and clarity. Margaret understood that restoration does not arrive with drama. It arrives through steady action. And for the first time since the question had been asked across her Thanksgiving table, she felt certain that the foundation beneath her life was being set straight again. Daniel arrived at Margaret's house 3 days later alone. The early December air carried a sharper chill now, and the maple tree in her front yard stood nearly bare. Margaret saw his car pull into the driveway and felt a steady calm rather than anticipation. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked older than he had the week before, not in years but in awareness. There was no hurried confidence in his posture, no distracted glance at his phone. He stepped inside and removed his coat carefully, as though entering a place that required respect. They sat at the kitchen table where so much of her life had unfolded. Daniel placed a folder on the table between them. The account is permanently closed, he said. The funds are being transferred into a trust under your name. The deed is being recorded properly this time, directly and legally. Margaret listened without interrupting. She noticed the absence of Victoria's presence. It was not hostility that she felt, but space. Daniel continued. Victoria admitted she redirected the transfers. She said she intended to reinvest the money temporarily to grow it. She believed it would benefit everyone in the long term. Margaret folded her hands gently on the table. Did she believe that? Or did she prefer control? She asked quietly. Daniel looked down at the folder. I do not know anymore. The simplicity of his answer carried more weight than any explanation. Margaret did not ask for details about arguments or consequences. She did not need to hear raised voices or accusations. What mattered was that Daniel had seen clearly. He had confronted not just the paperwork, but the pattern. We are separating our finances immediately, he added. All shared authority has been revoked. Margaret nodded once. She had spent decades understanding that financial boundaries are not expressions of mistrust, but of responsibility. Daniel looked around the kitchen then, as though seeing it for the first time. The aging refrigerator. The small crack near the ceiling where paint had peeled. Mom, he said softly. Why did you never tell me you were struggling? Margaret considered the question carefully. Because I did not want to be a burden. She replied. And because I believed you were already doing your best. The words hung between them without bitterness. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing what that meant. For years he had assumed provision equaled presence. He had believed transfers and documents could replace direct conversation. Margaret reached across the table and rested her hand briefly over his. "This is not about the lake house," she said gently. "It is about remembering who we are responsible for." Daniel nodded, his expression no longer defensive, but resolute. Outside, a thin layer of frost had begun to form along the edges of the lawn. The world felt quiet, steady. Margaret understood that consequences would continue to unfold beyond this moment. Trust would need rebuilding. Structures would need reinforcement. But as she looked at her son sitting across from her, no longer distracted, no longer distant, she felt something stronger than disappointment. She felt restoration beginning not in property deeds or account balances, but in clarity. And clarity, once reclaimed, reshapes everything that follows. The following week moved with quiet efficiency. Legal paperwork traveled back and forth between offices in Chicago and the small county near Lake Morrison. Margaret received copies by certified mail, each envelope thick with official language and embossed seals. She read every page slowly at her kitchen table, her glasses resting low on her nose, a pen in her hand to underline key clauses. The property was being transferred directly into a revocable trust established solely for her benefit. The monthly funds that had once been redirected were restored in full, along with documented interest. Daniel insisted that future financial support, if any, would be transparent and confirmed in person. Margaret appreciated the structure, not because she desired more money, but because clarity now mattered more than generosity. On a crisp Saturday morning, Daniel drove her north to see the lakeside property for the first time. The journey took a little over 3 hours, passing open fields, gas stations, and small towns decorated with early holiday lights. Margaret watched the landscape roll by, noticing how different it felt to travel without uncertainty pressing at her thoughts. When they finally turned onto the narrow road leading to the water, she saw the house come into view between tall pines. It was modest but well built, painted a soft gray with a wooden deck facing the lake. The dock extended about 20 feet into still, reflective water. There was no grand entrance, no dramatic reveal, only quiet space and open sky. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped aside so she could enter first. The interior smelled faintly of fresh wood and unused air. Sunlight filtered through wide windows, casting long shapes across the hardwood floors. Margaret walked slowly from room to room, touching the kitchen counter, glancing at the simple fireplace, pausing near the window that overlooked the water. She did not gasp or cry. She simply absorbed it. "It should have been yours from the beginning," Daniel said quietly behind her. Margaret turned to face him. "Ownership is not about timing," she replied gently. "It is about truth." They stepped outside onto the deck. The lake stretched calm and silver under the pale winter sun. A pair of ducks moved across the surface, leaving faint ripples behind them. Margaret felt the cold air against her cheeks and realized that this place did not represent loss. It represented correction. The structure stood solid, unembellished, honest in its simplicity, much like the life she had always tried to lead. Daniel stood beside her without speaking, his hands in his coat pockets. The silence between them felt different now. Not strained, not fragile. It felt grounded. Margaret understood that consequences had extended beyond legal documents. Trust had been recalibrated. Boundaries had been redrawn. She looked out over the water and imagined summer mornings with coffee on the deck, quiet evenings with a book near the window. Not as an escape, but as a continuation. The lake reflected the sky clearly, undisturbed. And in that still reflection, Margaret recognized something she had nearly lost. Not property, not money, but alignment between intention and action. And that, more than anything else, was worth protecting. Winter settled fully over the lake within a month, covering the shoreline with a thin, crystalline frost that shimmered under the pale morning sun. Margaret stood on the wooden deck wrapped in a wool coat, her breath visible in the cold air, and watched the surface of the water turn slowly to glass. The house behind her was quiet, furnished simply with pieces Daniel had arranged, but left largely untouched, so she could choose what felt right. She had decided to spend several weeks there before the holidays, not as a retreat from her life in Ohio, but as a quiet acknowledgement that something new had begun. The legal matters had concluded without spectacle. The trust was fully established in her name. The funds were restored and accounted for. Daniel had separated his finances entirely and moved into a small apartment temporarily while he and Victoria navigated the consequences of her decisions. Margaret did not ask for details about their private conversations. She understood that accountability unfolds differently for each person. What mattered was that Daniel now visited without distraction, without glancing at his phone every few minutes. He arrived one Saturday morning carrying groceries and a toolbox. Without ceremony, he fixed the loose cabinet hinge in her kitchen and adjusted the deck railing that had shifted slightly in the cold. They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Later, as they sat near the fireplace with mugs of coffee, Daniel spoke carefully. "I thought success meant building more," he admitted. "More assets, more growth, more complexity." Margaret listened, the firelight reflecting softly in her eyes. "Success means maintaining what is essential," she replied, "and knowing who it is meant to protect." The words were not delivered as judgment, only as clarity. Outside, the frozen lake stretched wide and still. Margaret realized that she no longer felt the faint anxiety that had once followed her every bill and home repair. The relief was not extravagant. It was steady. She had begun planning modest improvements for her Ohio house, replacing the aging roof and upgrading the furnace before spring. Not because she could now afford luxury, but because she valued stability. One afternoon, she walked alone along the narrow path by the lake, her boots crunching over frozen leaves. She considered how easily the situation might have remained hidden if not for one simple question. A single moment of confusion had uncovered 2 years of misdirection. Yet she felt no desire for revenge. What had been corrected did not require dramatics. It required vigilance. When she returned to the deck, she paused and looked across the still water. The lake reflected the pale sky with exact precision, untroubled by the wind. Margaret understood then that clarity is not loud. It does not demand applause. It arrives quietly, like winter settling over the shoreline, revealing the outlines of everything that stands beneath it. She had not lost her son. She had not lost herself. What she had regained was alignment between trust and truth. And, as the sun lowered behind the trees, casting long silver shadows across the frozen surface, Margaret felt certain that the foundation of her life, once tested, now stood stronger than before.